Welcome to Cat Has Questions, curiosity, stories, and the strange corners of everyday life. Hello, I'm Kat. The story I have today is a very interesting one. It is one about a disappearance, but also with a twist where there are other women who come in and save the day. Let's get into it. On March 8th, 2021, 12 jurors in Pueblo, Colorado were asked to answer a question investigators had been carrying for more than 8 years. Did Donthe Isaiah Richard Lucas murder 21-year-old Kelsie Schelling? Prosecutors couldn't show the jury where Kelsie was killed. They couldn't show them a murder weapon, a crime scene, or even Kelsie's body. More than 8 years after she disappeared, investigators still hadn't found her. And yet, after weeks of testimony, surveillance footage, phone and banking records, witness accounts, and years of investigative work, the jury found Donthe Lucas guilty of first-degree murder. So, how do 12 people become convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that a murder had occurred, when the victim has never been found? To answer that, we have to go back before the trial, before the suspect, before the missing person investigation. Because this story began with 21-year-old Kelsie Schelling, a daughter, a friend, and a woman who had just learned she was pregnant. On February 4th, 2013, Kelsie drove from Denver to Pueblo, believing she was going to meet the father of her unborn child. Instead, she vanished. What followed became an 8-year puzzle built from surveillance footage, cell phone records, bank transactions, and the movements of Kelsie's black Chevrolet Cruze. Her family refused to stop searching. Prosecutors eventually made the extraordinary decision to try a murder case without ever recovering the victim. And years after Kelsie disappeared, another woman, someone who had never met her, inserted herself into the life of the man at the center of the investigation. She got to know him. She dated him. She listened. And eventually, she took the witness stand. This is the story of Kelsie Schelling. Long before Kelsie Schelling's name appeared on national news, before investigators searched for her, before prosecutors stood before a jury trying to prove a murder without a body, she was simply a young woman trying to figure out adulthood. Kelsie Jean Schelling was 21 years old. She had grown up in Colorado, surrounded by a close-knit family, especially her mother, Lauren Suhr. By 2013, Kelsie had moved to Denver, was working, and was building a life of her own. Friends described her as kind, dependable, and deeply connected to the people she loved. She regularly stayed in touch with family and friends, an important detail once investigators had to decide whether she could have left voluntarily. At trial, the prosecutors returned to this point repeatedly. Before jurors heard about surveillance footage or ATM withdrawals, they first had to understand who Kelsie was and whether disappearing without a word fit the life she had been living. Several years earlier, while attending Northeastern Junior College in Sterling, Colorado, Kelsie met a fellow student named Donthe Lucas. Friends later described the relationship as on again, off again. They broke up and reconciled more than once. By early 2013, the relationship no longer appeared stable, but they were still communicating. Then everything changed. Kelsie learned she was pregnant. According to later court testimony and reporting, she believed Donthe was the father of her baby. According to Lauren Suhr, Kelsie wasn't talking about running away from her future. She was trying to figure out how to move forward with it. Laura, her mom, has publicly said she assured her daughter that whatever happened, whether Donthe wanted to be involved or not, she would not be facing motherhood alone. Laura would later remember telling her daughter, "I will support you whether Donthe is in the picture or not in the picture. It's going to be okay." Looking back years later, Laura said Kelsie's reaction never suggested someone preparing to walk away from her life. Quote, "She was happy. She wanted that baby. She wanted to be a mom." Quote. That reassurance later mattered at trial. Prosecutors argued Kelsie had family, support, plans, and a child on the way. She had reasons to stay. On the morning of February 4th, 2013, Kelsie attended a prenatal appointment in Denver. The appointment confirmed she was approximately 8 weeks pregnant. According to the federal civil complaint later filed by her family, Donthe Lucas and his mother had been calling and texting Kelsie before the appointment, encouraging her to come to Pueblo. Rather than canceling her doctor's visit, Kelsie chose to keep the appointment first and then make the drive south afterward. That sequence mattered. Kelsie kept the medical appointment, confirmed the pregnancy, and only then left Denver. According to investigators, she got into her black Chevy Cruze and headed south toward Pueblo, a drive of roughly 2 hours along Interstate 25. We can't know what Kelsie was thinking during that drive. What we do know is what she expected at the end of it. She believed she was meeting the father of her unborn child to discuss their future. By the next morning, Kelsie would be gone. So, on the afternoon of February 4th, Kelsie drove that 2 hours to Pueblo to meet Donthe because Donthe, according to the civil complaint later filed by Kelsie's family, Lucas had been urging her to come to Pueblo. So they were encouraging her to make that trip. Those communications helped explain why Kelsie willingly drove more than 100 miles that evening. At some point after leaving Denver, Kelsie arrived in Pueblo. According to investigators, the agreed-upon meeting location was the Walmart located at 4080 West Northern Avenue. It was approximately 11:20 p.m. That's one of the first timestamps in this case that investigators were able to verify with confidence. Kelsie pulled into the parking lot, but Donthe wasn't there. At least, not where she expected him to be. According to the family's lawsuit, Lucas continued communicating with Kelsie after she arrived, instructing her to wait and directing her to other locations rather than immediately meeting her. Prosecutors would later argue that those messages documented an evening that wasn't unfolding the way Kelsie believed it would. She waited. Minutes turned into an hour, and then, just after midnight, investigators believe Kelsie sent what became one of the most significant text messages in the entire case. At approximately 12:32 a.m., she texted Lucas, asking where he was and telling him that she had already been waiting for more than an hour. According to the civil complaint, this was the last communication confidently attributed to Kelsie before she disappeared. The message was pretty ordinary. It didn't suggest Kelsie believed she was in danger. It sounded like someone a little annoyed that they were waiting for a person who had failed to show up. But because of what happened next, investigators would spend years studying that final exchange. Communication did continue after that final known text. The complaint alleges that a call was placed to Kelsie's phone at approximately 3:54 a.m., and it further alleges that later messages sent from her phone appeared inconsistent with her normal writing style. Those allegations become part of the family's civil claims, though they should be distinguished from facts independently established at the criminal trial. Those details raised difficult questions. If Kelsie was no longer using her phone, who was? If someone else sent those messages, why? And if Lucas truly hadn't met Kelsie, how did investigators later place him in possession of her car less than 12 hours later? At that moment, though, no one was asking those questions. Laura Saxton wasn't calling hospitals. Friends weren't organizing searches. As far as anyone knew, Kelsie had simply gone to meet someone she trusted. But by the following morning, something happened that transformed this case forever. Surveillance cameras captured Kelsie's black Chevy Cruze. Only Kelsie wasn't driving it. By the morning of February 5th, 2013, so the next day, Kelsie Schelling had effectively disappeared, but no one knew that yet. To the outside world, Tuesday morning looked like any other. But while Kelsie had seemingly vanished, something connected to her kept moving. Her black Chevy Cruze. Much of the case would eventually revolve around that one vehicle. There was no known crime scene, no body, no witness who could tell detectives what happened. Instead, prosecutors treated Kelsie's car as a silent witness. It couldn't tell investigators what happened, but every place it appeared, every minute it moved, every surveillance camera that captured it became another piece of the puzzle. So at approximately 11:39 a.m. on February 5th, so like I said, this is the next day after she had driven down to Pueblo, surveillance cameras captured one of the most important moments in the investigation. A man drove Kelsie's Chevy Cruze to an ATM. Prosecutors identified that man as Donthe Lucas. According to investigators, Lucas withdrew $400 using Kelsie's debit card. Kelsie herself was not visible in the surveillance footage. Less than 12 hours earlier, Kelsie had driven to Pueblo to meet him, and now he was driving her vehicle and using her ATM card. Obviously, this doesn't prove murder, and there are possible innocent explanations. Maybe Kelsie loaned him the car or asked him to withdraw money or let him use her money regularly. That is why prosecutors never asked the jury to view the ATM footage in isolation. They argued it was one piece of a much larger pattern. After leaving the ATM, surveillance continued documenting the movements of Kelsie's Cruze. According to the family's lawsuit, Lucas drove the vehicle back to the Walmart parking lot where Kelsie had waited the night before. The complaint alleges he parked the Cruze, walked behind the store, and was picked up by his mother, Sarah Lucas, and another family member of his, Vivian Lucas. These details are allegations from the family's civil complaint, and not every part of that account was independently established at the criminal trial. Investigators were not relying on memory. They were following surveillance cameras minute by minute. But the Cruze wasn't finished telling its story. According to the lawsuit, the vehicle remained in the Walmart parking lot for roughly 18 hours longer. Their surveillance cameras captured another person approaching the car and driving away. That raised an entirely new set of questions. Who was driving? Why move the vehicle again? Was that person acting alone or at someone else's direction? Those questions became part of the broader investigation, though not every detail could ultimately be answered with certainty. Eventually, investigators located Kelsie's Chevy Cruze at St. Mary Corwin Medical Center in Pueblo. Once again, surveillance cameras had captured its arrival. Footage showed someone parking the vehicle before walking away. At first glance, finding the car might seem like a breakthrough. In reality, it created even more work. Because now investigators had to answer another question. Could the car tell them what happened to Kelsie? Crime scene technicians carefully processed the vehicle. They searched for fingerprints, DNA, hair, fibers, biological evidence, anything that might explain what happened after Kelsie arrived in Pueblo. Investigators documented numerous items from the vehicle and examined everything from fingerprints to the vehicle's navigation system and OnStar data. The lawsuit also criticizes aspects of how certain evidence was handled during the investigation. Those concerns later became central to the family's lawsuit. The complaint alleged that opportunities had been missed and that evidence should have been handled differently. The defendants disputed those claims. Regardless of the legal outcome, the lawsuit shows the family's growing frustration as the investigation stretched from weeks into months and eventually into years. Investigators did not find one dramatic piece of forensic evidence that solved this case. There was no blood inside the car, conclusively linking it to a homicide, no murder weapon. Instead, they kept returning to something less dramatic. The movement. Movement of the car, movement of Kelsie's debit card, movement of cell phones, and movement of people. Every surveillance camera captured another few seconds investigators could compare against phone records, interviews, and later testimony. What they did not have, though, was proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And for the next several years, that's exactly what they would spend their time trying to build. For Kelsie Schelling's family, the days after her disappearance became weeks to months, months to years. And despite everything investigators had collected, Kelsie was still missing. That's one of the hardest realities of a no-body homicide investigation. Detectives may strongly suspect what happened, but suspicion isn't enough. Prosecutors have to prove a crime occurred, and without a body, that becomes one of the most difficult burdens in criminal law. Laura Saxton refused to let her daughter disappear from public memory. She gave interviews, organized searches, spoke at community events, and worked with volunteers. She pleaded with anyone who might know something to come forward. Eventually, the family's frustration with the investigation reached a breaking point. In 2016, that's when Laura filed a federal civil lawsuit against the city of Pueblo, members of the Pueblo Police Department, and others involved in the investigation. The lawsuit alleged numerous investigative failures, including claims that evidence wasn't processed, surveillance opportunities were missed, and additional steps should have been taken during the investigation. But it also showed exactly where Laura believed the investigation to have fallen short. The lawsuit points to concerns about the handling of her vehicle, digital evidence, surveillance footage, and investigative decisions. Whatever the ultimate merits of each allegation, one thing was clear. Laura wasn't waiting for answers. She was fighting for them. Even with that pressure, the case still seemed stuck, and public attention faded. Then, something happened that almost no one saw coming. It wasn't new DNA. It wasn't the discovery of Kelsie's remains. It wasn't a sudden confession. It was another young woman. A woman who had never met Kelsie, never met Laura, had no official role in the investigation. But she couldn't stop thinking about the case. Her name was Lauren Suhr. She was about to make one of the most unusual decisions we've ever covered on this podcast. By 2017, Kelsie Schelling had been missing for 4 years. Investigators had a timeline that pointed repeatedly toward Donthe Lucas. But suspicion, even strong suspicion, is not the same as proving murder. So Lauren did not know Kelsie, like I said. She wasn't employed by law enforcement. She wasn't working undercover. Lauren later explained exactly what motivated her. Quote, "As a mom, I couldn't even begin to fathom knowing that your child's out there or not out there." Quote. She simply described her original goal. Quote, "The plan was basically just to kind of befriend him, get to know him, try and meet him, see what his family was like, and see if I could get him to talk about anything." Quote. According to Lauren's public interviews, she eventually reached out to Donthe Lucas. This part of the story does get a little exaggerated sometimes just because it is pretty out there. But to be clear, Lauren was not a police officer, and the available reporting doesn't support the claim that investigators recruited her to go undercover or anything like that. These initial decisions were hers entirely, and only later did she become an important witness. The truth is unusual enough without turning her into an undercover operative, a private citizen, willing to build a relationship with a man she believed might have gotten away with murder. So it began with a simple conversation, messages, getting to know one another. Eventually, those conversations became dates, then a relationship. The more time Lauren spent with Lucas, the more he talked. According to Lauren's later testimony, Lucas discussed Kelsie frequently. He described her as an ex-girlfriend, and he denied murdering her. But he also made statements about the case that caught Lauren's attention. He admitted to driving Kelsie's Chevy Cruze. He admitted to moving the vehicle after her disappearance. Those admissions matter because the surveillance had already placed Lucas behind the wheel. Lauren's account did not create that evidence, but it corroborated it. During later interviews, Lauren described Lucas as someone who could become emotional when talking about Kelsie. She testified that he cried, that he insisted he hadn't killed her. Yet, at the same time, portions of his explanations about the events surrounding Kelsie's disappearance appeared inconsistent with other evidence investigators had gathered. That inconsistency would become important during the trial. Jurors weren't simply deciding whether Lucas had driven Kelsie's car. They were deciding whether they believed his explanations. So if he's changing his story back and forth, that makes him way less credible. Then, this relationship that began because Lauren wanted to figure out answers to this case. There was a big turn. Lucas proposed marriage to Lauren. Lauren has publicly described him crying and hyperventilating during the proposal. Lauren later described the emotional conflict she experienced while spending time with Lucas. Quote, "He has this way about him that makes you feel so sorry for him. He comes off so lost and hurt. In the back of my mind, I always kept that he is potentially a murderer." Quote, by that point, she knew she couldn't continue the relationship. She ended it. It would be inaccurate to say Lauren solved the case. She strengthened an investigation that had already been underway for years. She did not replace the surveillance, the ATM footage, the digital evidence, but she became another witness whose account prosecutors could compare against the existing record. After years of waiting, detectives believed they had finally reached that point. For the first time since Kelsie disappeared, prosecutors believed they could prove something that had once seemed almost impossible, that even without recovering Kelsie, they could prove she had been murdered. So now prosecutors have to build a murder case without a body. And by the time prosecutors decide to charge Donthe Lucas with first-degree murder, they knew exactly what the defense was going to say. Ladies and gentlemen, where is the body? It's one of the oldest and most powerful arguments in criminal law. If no one has found the victim, how can anyone say with certainty a murder even occurred? In many murder cases, prosecutors build around one overwhelming fact: a confession, DNA, a murder weapon, an eyewitness. In Kelsie Schelling's case, there was none of these things. Instead, prosecutors built what lawyers sometimes call a circumstantial case. And circumstantial does not automatically mean weak. Fingerprints, DNA, and surveillance footage can all be circumstantial. The legal question is whether the evidence taken together proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's exactly what prosecutors asked the jury to consider. So piece 1, Kelsie never came home. Prosecutors began with perhaps the simplest fact of the entire case. Kelsie disappeared. Forever. She never used bank accounts again. She never contacted her mother. She never returned to work. She never sought medical care for her pregnancy that had just been confirmed. So even if she had run away and wanted to start a new life, she would have had to go to a doctor at some point. Prosecutors argued that wasn't the behavior of someone voluntarily starting over. It was consistent with someone whose life had ended. Piece 2 is opportunity. So prosecutors had to establish an opportunity. They argued Donthe had been communicating with Kelsie before she drove to Pueblo. She made the trip because she expected to meet him. She arrived, she waited. She sent the now famous text asking where he was after waiting for an hour in a Walmart parking lot. I would be pissed. Because it establishes something critical. The last known plans Kelsie had involved Donthe Lucas. Prosecutor Kyle McCarthy later explained why the text message mattered. Quote, "We know that that's his phone. He admitted to those text messages. We know that that's his thoughts and feelings about it. That's direct evidence." Piece 3, possession of the car. So next, prosecutors turned to that surveillance footage. It was a video. Less than 12 hours after Kelsie arrived in Pueblo, the cameras caught Lucas driving her car. He withdrew hundreds of dollars from her debit card, and Kelsie wasn't there. Again, prosecutors didn't argue this proved murder by itself. Instead, they asked, why would Lucas have Kelsie's car and Kelsie's debit card if Kelsie herself was nowhere to be found? Piece 4 being the timeline. Detectives reconstructed nearly every significant movement investigators could verify. The doctor's appointment, the drive from Denver, Walmart, the final text, the ATM, returning to Walmart, and the abandoned car. And then piece 5, Lucas's own statement. Prosecutors also compared Lucas's statement over time. Detectives had interviewed him. Lauren later testified about conversations she had with him years after. Prosecutors argued that portions of Lucas's explanation changed as investigators uncovered more evidence. In any criminal trial, jurors are allowed to consider credibility. Is someone's story consistent? Does it match the evidence? So prosecutors argued those inconsistencies matter. And he was being inconsistent. He would change his story. Piece 6 was Lauren's testimony. Lauren wasn't presented as someone who solved the case. She couldn't tell jurors what happened on February 4th. She wasn't there. Instead, prosecutors used Lauren to corroborate parts of the investigation that they had already spent years building. According to her testimony, Lucas admitted driving the Cruze. He discussed moving the vehicle, and he talked about Kelsie. Her testimony fit into an investigative framework that already existed. It was just another piece confirming what detectives have already believed. Prosecutors also acknowledged what they didn't have. They told the jurors there was no body, no murder weapon, no eyewitness, no confession. And yet, they argued the absence of those things didn't erase everything that they did have. The defense saw the same evidence and reached a completely different conclusion. They argued investigators had built a theory, not proof. They challenged witnesses, they questioned assumptions, they emphasized the lack of forensic evidence directly proving how or where Kelsie died. And perhaps most importantly, they reminded jurors that Lucas didn't have to prove his innocence. The burden rested entirely on the prosecution. If reasonable doubt remained, the law required a verdict of not guilty. And that's where the case stood. Now, only 12 people could decide which side was right. So the verdict. By early 2021, more than 8 years had passed since Kelsie Schelling disappeared. Now a jury would decide one question. Did Donthe Lucas intentionally murder Kelsie Schelling? When the trial finally began in Pueblo County District Court, jurors weren't being asked to solve every mystery surrounding Kelsie's disappearance. Their responsibility was much narrower. Had prosecutors proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Donthe Lucas intentionally caused Kelsie's death? Laura Saxton, her mother, also took the witness stand, and it was explaining about who Kelsie was. Jurors heard about her daughter's close relationship with her family, her excitement about becoming a mother, her plans for the future. They argued Kelsie had every reason to continue living the life she had been building. It was whether Kelsie had voluntarily disappeared at all. But then came one of the trial's most anticipated witnesses, Lauren Suhr. By the time she entered the courtroom, jurors had already heard about all the surveillance footage, all the timeline stuff, yada, yada, yada. But Lauren's testimony, she testified about her relationship with Lucas, the conversations they shared, his descriptions of Kelsie, his admission about driving and moving her car, which is huge, because if you admit to moving her car after she died, well, or after she disappeared, then like, okay, well, where'd she go then? Did she tell you you're telling me she just disappeared and then you took her car? Why? The defense's point was simple. Credibility was not automatic, and Lauren's account had to be tested against the rest of the evidence. So after the jury deliberated on the charge of first-degree murder, the jury found Donthe Lucas guilty. The courtroom had finally answered the legal question that had remained unresolved since February of 2013. Donthe Lucas was later sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence for the conviction. For prosecutors and investigators, it was a rare murder conviction in a case where the victim's body had never been recovered. For Laura Saxton, it meant accountability. Laura later reflected on the verdict, quote, "It was just so emotional for everybody, for both sides. I mean, it's a sad story. It's a sad situation that didn't have to end up like this if he had just let her come home," quote. But accountability isn't always the same as closure. Because despite the guilty verdict, one question remained exactly as it had been the day Kelsie disappeared. Where is Kelsie Schelling? And one of the biggest takeaways about this, too, is the fact that Lauren Suhr was so brave to insert herself like that. I'm definitely not encouraging people to do that, to try to start dating people who are potentially murderers, but that was kind of the final piece of the puzzle that investigators needed to solve this case, which is just wild. Laura has often said that despite the conviction, something is still missing. Quote, "I'm never going to recover without getting her back. I still have nowhere to go take flowers, to go sit and talk with her, take her balloons on her birthday, go to her on holidays. I have nothing. Donthe took that away from me." If you enjoyed today's story, follow the show and share it with someone. Stay curious. Thanks for listening to Cat Has Questions. If you liked this episode, follow the show and share it with someone who loves a good spiral. See you next week.